Welcome to Lantern Voices, a podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media.
Welcome back to Lantern Voices, a podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. Thank you very much for joining us here for a brand new episode after a little July break. My name is Louisa. I will be your host for this episode, and we are back with a very special guest for you. Zoe Weil wrote 8 books, and among them are The World Becomes What We Teach, Educating a Generation of Solutionaries, and the middle grade fiction book, Claude and Medea, both published by Lantern Publishing and Media. Zoe is the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education, and she's considered a pioneer in the comprehensive humane education movement, the movement that works to create a peaceful, regenerative, and equitable world for everyone. In our conversation, Zoe and I talked about the humane education movement, about her books, about the importance of keeping the hopes up, and of working with a solutionary approach. Do you want to know more about humane education and what it means to be a solutionary? Then let's jump to our interview. And don't forget, stay with us until the very end for our special announcements. Let's go welcome Zoe Weil to Lantern Voices. Zoe, welcome to Lantern Voices. Thank you for your time and for being here with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to jump right in the first question. Besides being a humane educator, you are the author of 8 books. Today, we'll talk about the 2 books that you have with us here at Lantern. Our main focus will be The World Becomes What We Teach, a nonfiction book about humane education, but we'll also chat a little bit about Claude and Medea, your middle grade fiction book. To start off, could you share with our listeners a bit about your trajectory with humane education, what led you to humane education, and eventually the foundation of the Institute for Humane Education?
Sure. I learned about what was happening to animals and to the environment, and also a lot about racial justice issues when I was in high school and then in college and then shortly after college. I didn't grow up in an activist household. I wasn't sure what I could do to change some of the injustices and cruelties that I was seeing beyond sort of changing my personal choices, like becoming vegetarian. And then I was looking for a summer job. I was in graduate school, and I found a program that offered week-long courses to middle school students. And so I pitched a whole bunch of courses, like 5 courses, and one of them was on animal issues, and one of them was on environmental issues. And the animal issues course was the second most popular of the 60 courses that were offered that summer because kids love animals and they wanted to learn about them. And so in the course of that week, I watched as the students became activists literally overnight in one case. One boy, having learned about product testing on animals, went home that night and he made his own homemade leaflets. Now, this was back in 1987. He did not have a personal computer. He literally hand wrote those leaflets, and he came back with a stack of them into class the next day. And while the rest of us were having lunch, he was standing on a Philadelphia street corner handing out his homemade leaflets. So that made me realize that there was a kind of change-making activism that was really aligned with my skills and what I enjoyed doing. So at the same time, I was looking for other ways I could help, and I had subscribed to the PETA newsletter. This was back when it was just a little, not fancy newsletter. And there were suggestions to write letters to the CEOs of companies and to legislators, and I did those sorts of things. And then I connected with some activists who were leafleting and protesting, and I did those things. And I liked writing letters. It wasn't that I didn't feel like it was worthwhile, but I didn't know the kind of impact I was having. I definitely did not enjoy leafleting and protesting. It wasn't my style of trying to create change. I don't really like conflict. And it
Mhm.
really hurt when people would yell at me, like, get a life, when I'd be on a street handing out a leaflet or at a protest. And it also drove me crazy when people would take a leaflet and then drop it on the ground a few feet later. So I realized I needed to find my own path. And having taught those courses, and then the next summer I taught those same courses again, I realized the power of what I call humane education, of teaching about these issues and watching as people really create change overnight. And then I realized, like, this could be much bigger. And so I was hired by an animal rights organization, and I said, "How about I start an education program here?" And that was the American Anti-Vivisection Society, and they said, "Great." And so I created the program Animal Learn, and we started going into schools, and I was doing assembly programs and after-school programs and classroom presentations, and I was eventually the program was reaching about 10,000 students a year, which was great, but it still felt like a drop in the bucket and also not really integrated into the curriculum, just a one-off. And sometimes it would be a debate format, which is not my favorite format. And so that's why I co-founded the Institute for Humane Education in 1996 to really create this movement and to help others become humane educators. If they were activists, they could become humane educators. If they were teachers, they could learn to integrate these issues into their classroom. And so I've been doing that ever since.
That's fantastic. I want to ask you, how is the work of the Institute going recently and throughout history? And I also have some other follow up questions as I was noting, taking notes as you were saying. But let's start with this one. How is the work of the Institute today with all those years of history that you have in the Institute's back now?
Well, so when I co-founded the Institute for Humane Education, IHE, it was with a definition of humane education that was fully comprehensive. So issues around human rights, issues around environmental sustainability, and issues around animal protection, as well as issues around culture and change making were all integrated. So we ended up creating the first graduate programs in the field, which we offer through Antioch University. They're online, so we have students from all over the US and Canada and other countries. And the idea was to educate people really deeply in these interconnected issues with the goal of ensuring that their audiences, whether they were, students in classrooms or they were adults or non-traditional educational settings or at camps, that the students would have the tools and the motivation and the thinking capabilities to solve the problems that they were facing, to create more justice and to create a more humane world and to create a more peaceful world. And we eventually started calling that solutionaries, calling those people solutionaries. And so one of the ways that things have evolved at the Institute is we now have a really robust solutionary program where we have a framework. It's a 4-phase framework to identify problems, to investigate them thoroughly, to innovate a solution and to implement that solution with this ethical foundation of doing the most good and the least harm to people, animals, and the environment. And that framework is being adopted all over the world. We're in more than 30 countries, and we're in many communities in a deep level here in the United States. And that has really brought a way of thinking and a mindset that is welcomed by schools. There are teachers who are learning how to integrate this framework into what they teach so that they're not telling students what to think. They're not telling students what to feel. They're inviting students to work together collaboratively around a problem they care about and solve it in a way that does the most good and the least harm and really understand the impact on all stakeholders. So that's the direction that we have moved in. And you mentioned my book at Lantern, The World Becomes What We Teach. It's subtitled Educating a Generation of Solutionaries. And it's not just a humane education book. This is a book on education. And, it became an Amazon bestseller in the philosophy and social aspects of education. It's not a niche book for humane educators. It is a book for all educators to rethink the very purpose of the educational process and of schooling in our country.
Lantern Publishing and Media is devoted to sharing messages of compassion. Our books inspire a better world by telling the stories of animal rights activists, climate activists, and their fights for a world where everyone can live in harmony, no matter their species. Lantern is a 501c non-for-profit organization. Your donation helps us keep our work going. If you can, go to lanternpm.org/donate to help us with any amount. Once again, the website is lanternpm.org/donate. Your generous gift enables you to support our collective mission to inform, inspire, and educate. Thank you very much.
Definitely. And you mentioned you're present in more than 30 countries in the world. So not only in the US, but throughout the planet as well. And as I was reading your book, I identified I have an age gap. I always talk in the podcast. I think the listeners at this point know my entire family history, but I have an age gap brother and an age gap sister. And when I was leaving high school, my brother was starting in school. And he started in a school that my mom picked because of their more humane approach. I don't know if they use the equivalent in Portuguese of humane, but it is definitely what, as I was reading, I could pinpoint. It was like, oh, that thing was one of the pillars that as a family, because his school is about integrating family as well. So we learn a lot about the education that the kids were having because we were called to be a part of lectures, to be a part of events, to be a part of games that in the end were just something like a means to an end, and learning more about how the school works. So I was like, oh yeah, I know this one. I know this one. Oh, look at that. So it was interesting to be able to recognize that in my brother's education.
Yeah, that's great that your parents chose a school with that in mind.
And you were mentioning about having a more non-confrontational personality, and that kind of led you to education. I thought that was very interesting. I recently learned that there are multiple types of activism out there. When I was younger, I thought it would just like picket lines and that's it. And now there was even circulating in the internet somewhere like a little circle, all colorful, showing what is your personality, like how do you identify best, and educating and working with education. It's great for people who are not necessarily confrontational people or who don't want to or cannot be for any reasons with like the picket lines all the way in front, because it makes as much change, if not more, because long term.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that education is the root system underlying all other societal systems. So I have been very vocal about this in the animal rights community, that we neglect education at our peril. So I think it's a really effective way to create change. The difference between a picket line or writing a pamphlet and being a teacher is that when you are a teacher, your job is not to tell people what they should think or do. And I think a lot of activists want to tell people what they should do, like don't eat meat or don't do this or, buy cruelty-free products. And that isn't the job of educators. And so it's not for everyone. Like if you want to tell people what to do, you should not be a humane educator. One of the things that I tell people when they're thinking about how can I be a solutionary, and I think of solutionaries as sort of taking activism to the next level. And what I always ask people to do is ask themselves 3 questions. What issues most concern me? What problems do I want to solve? What am I good at? And what do I love to do? Because if you can line those up, your life is sort of golden, right? You're going to be doing meaningful work that makes a difference, and you're good at it and you love it. So I think it's really important that we ask ourselves those questions when we're trying to find our path to make a difference.
And since we are talking already about being a solutionary, I want to ask you for our listeners to give two definitions. First, of what is a solutionary and how to be a solutionary, and what is humane education under the perspective of the Institute for Humane Education.
Humane education explores the interconnected issues of human rights and animal protection and environmental sustainability with a goal of educating people to be solutionaries. And a solutionary is somebody who can identify unjust, inhumane, unsustainable systems and transform them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for people, animals, and the environment. So you can see how integrated humane education and solutionary are as terms. Yeah, I think the only other thing I would say about being a solutionary is that solutionaries cultivate a solutionary mindset and they cultivate solutionary thinking. And solutionary thinking is comprised of many forms of thinking, but primarily it's comprised of critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking. And the mindset is a mindset that believes problems are solvable, that avoids binary either or framing or thinking, and that is willing to listen to different perspectives and collaborate and work across divides to solve problems that we can agree are problems.
You mentioned earlier that you're not very prone to the debate system, debate format. And I think in the book, this is the relationship between the debate format and the black and white yes and no approach. When we have a debate, we usually have somebody defending one side and somebody defending the other. And it's hard to find a dialogue in between.
Yeah, and it also, it's not only that it's hard to find the nuance or the dialogue in between, we're not even looking at the underlying problem. So I first became acutely aware of this when I was driving one day and I'm listening to the radio and I heard an ad for a debate at New York University as part of the Intelligence Squared series. And the debate was around whether or not the United States was responsible for Mexico's drug wars. And I remember how startled I was that here all these people were going to gather, experts were going to be brought in to argue one side or the other of what was a fabricated question. Like many debate topics, they are fabricated. Somebody is saying this is the question that we should be arguing about, and we should decide yes or no on this question. And so the audience is going to listen to these experts argue, and then they're going to vote on who won. And I just was so struck by how this time could be used so differently, that we could have had experts come together to talk about how do we solve Mexico's drug wars, or what are the underlying problems that are contributing to these drug wars, the economic and political and education systems that lead to this. Or we could have the experts come together to talk about what do we do about drug use and abuse and overdose deaths. And there's so many things we could talk about and try to solve. But instead, we were going to come together to argue and have a winner and a loser. And I think that that's so dominant in our culture around so many issues that it contributes to our polarization. And it inhibits our ability to actually solve problems because we're not identifying the problem. We're just arguing about maybe a soundbite or a meme or what's presented to us in the media or by politicians or in our education system in the debate format that's used so often in schools.
Funny, because I was listening today a Brazilian podcast with a journalist that was talking about polarization and the difficulty of people finding this common ground. And he was saying that one of the things that we ended up missing with social media was the actual meeting of people in a physical space and dialoguing with each other, taking action from that. He's like, in social media, it's easier for you to share a post and just emit an opinion and not actually take action.
And sometimes in really nasty ways that you would never say if that person were right in front of you. Or to share a meme that you haven't fact checked. So you're just spreading misinformation. I mean, it's so rampant. And the whole solutionary framework is designed to upend that you're going to have to really investigate that issue thoroughly before you determine where are the leverage points, what are the causes of this problem, where are the leverage points to solve it, and who are all the stakeholders I need to talk to, and who's benefiting from the problem and the systems that perpetuate it, and who's harmed. And by who, I don't just mean people, I mean animals and the environment as well. There's so much to unpack, and it takes a while, but that's the way we create change. We don't create change with memes.
We know the vegan activist community is out there, and we want to connect with each and every one of you. We are proud supporters of initiatives that fight for a more compassionate world for all animals, humans and non-humans alike. For more content on vegan activism, follow Lantern on social media. We are Lantern Publishing and Media on Facebook, at Lantern PM on Instagram, and at Lantern PM Official on TikTok.
We're talking about a polarized world. We're talking about social media and memes and just sharing opinions online. What it's like to advocate and implement humane education in schools in the world of today that is highly polarized. I've seen parents and people seeing those ideals presented to children, helping children to think for themselves and still being like, no, I don't want my child to think. I want my child to follow my ideals.
Yes, that's not new. I've been a humane educator for 35 plus years, and none of that's new. Parents have never wanted their kids to have very different values than they do. There's always been concern about controversial issues and people coming into schools with controversial issues. So it feels more present right now, but it isn't new. And I can say that in my experience of being a humane educator for so long, there are literally only two times where there has been any kind of backlash to my work in schools. And one time it was when a school wanted me to talk about food issues, specifically meat. Like the program was called Meet Your Meat. And it was for 7th graders. And I knew walking into it, I was really surprised. I was being invited to talk about that issue at an assembly program for 7th graders. And what ended up happening is after the presentation, 60 kids wouldn't eat their dinner that night, and the school got a lot of calls the next day. So they were pretty upset. What was ironic was that I did exactly what I said I was going to be talking about, because I really went over it carefully because it seemed unusual. But the vast majority of the time, if issues are presented in a non-biased way and with the approach of, you're going to need to investigate this, you're going to need to find out if these issues you're learning about here are true. You're going to need to talk to a variety of different people who might be affected by whatever the issue is, or who might be representing the issues if it relates to non-human animals or the environment. And you should get a lot of perspectives. And if you have education work that way, school is such a good place for controversial issues to be discussed. They just can't be presented in a biased way or in a way where you're trying to manipulate or cultivate activists. That's not the way it should be done. So I think good educators all know that, but schools are wary right now of a lot of issues. And part of what makes the solutionary framework so effective is that it's grounded in research and investigation and identifying problems and coming up with solutions that are good for everybody. So the very framework is antithetical to polarization. It's an antidote to polarization. We're finding that schools are really excited about it in a way that, part of the reason that I was often invited to schools in the debate format, so they'd invite me. I worked for an animal rights organization, so they'd invite me And then they'd invite somebody who did animal research to talk about the issue of animal experimentation. So in some sense, they were trying to present a controversial issue, but in a way that was unbiased by having two presenters. But it was still that debate. So what I would recommend now, I mean, I don't tend to go into schools very often. I'm going to be speaking at a school in a couple of days, but mostly we're educating the educators themselves. But what I would say now, if somebody invited me to do a debate on a topic like this is, you know what, let's talk about the underlying issue. And let's see if we can bring a variety of people together to talk about how could we reduce animal use in biomedical research. And that's happening right now at the governmental level. I don't think anybody would think that is something we shouldn't do, whether you're an animal researcher, an animal activist, that we could agree that it would be great if we could have alternatives. So let's talk about how we get there. And I think that that's exactly what a solutionary approach does. And it's why schools are receptive to it.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yes. Again, I'm thinking about my brother's school and about the lecturers and guests that we had there. And one of the issues that rose, I remember the most pressing issues that rose in the school when he was around, what grade was he in? I think fifth or fourth grade. And one of the issues were regarding to gender and kids who were identifying the different genders. And the school introduced a book that now the title even changed. At the time was still named George, and now the book is called Melissa, in order to talk about empathy. And gender is in the book, definitely. It's an important topic in that book, but it's mostly about empathy.
Yeah.
And still, so many so many parents did not read the book and were immediately targeting the school. So the reaction of the school was to invite those parents for a lecture from an educator on the field who was like, this is what it's appropriate to talk about with each age.
Yep.
This is how we teach empathy and everything. And that was the solution that they found, was with information.
Yeah.
And trying to meet people halfway.
Yeah. I told you there were only 2 incidences in all of these years that I've been a humane educator. And the other one was I was doing an assembly program for a school. And I asked the kids what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And one boy said war. And I agreed with him that war was a problem. Well, the principal became incensed that I would say that war was a problem because this was during the war in Iraq. And he said, he called me into his office and he said, we have parents who are in Iraq right now. I'm thinking, well, they know better than anybody that war is a problem. And I was doing a presentation for the community that night at the school. And I said, first of all, look, go talk to all the students who I just spoke to and ask them what they got out of my presentation. And they said things like, well, that it makes a difference what we do, our choices matter, like all these things that were, such deep truths. And then he came to the evening presentation. He thought he was going to get lots of calls from parents. He didn't get any calls from parents. Lots of people came to the evening presentation. Nobody was upset by it. Nobody came because they were upset. So sometimes we're very worried because we live in this culture, like you just described, like people haven't gone deep before they're really incensed. And that can be dissipated by just being together and listening and learning and talking.
Do you love new books? Do you need more titles about veganism, animal rights, and climate activism on your bookshelf? Then go to lanternpm.org and check out all our books and ebooks available for purchase. You can find anything from beautiful illustrated picture books that introduce children to the values of compassion for our fellow animals, to thoroughly researched nonfiction books that give you all the facts to help you live a healthy vegan life. Go to lanternpm.org and explore all of our books today.
Talking about your other book, Claude and Medea, about our other book as Lantern, there's one character in that book that is Miss Rattleby, and she's a substitute teacher that in her first class, she encouraged students to ask themselves why it is considered okay to eat some animals and not others. So I'm now wondering if that was even inspired about that experience that you had in that school. This causes like all students, even the ones who are making fun of her, to end up discussing the topic during lunchtime. Could Miss Rettleby be considered a humane educator?
Oh, well, Ms. Rattleby is definitely a humane educator, for sure, but she didn't ask the students or to, that question. She did an activity, a humane education activity that we call Alien in the Ethical Universe. And people can download this activity. They can find this activity. And I invite people to go to our website, humaneeducation.org. We have loads of resources there. But what she did in that activity, and she's a very eccentric character, but she pretended, she said, I have this friend, and this friend has been studying like how to be in the world. And will you answer my friend's questions? And the kids are like, yeah, I guess we'll answer the questions. And then she closes her eyes and she becomes this alien and she says, oh yeah, my friend is from another planet, is coming to Earth to understand how we should behave on Earth. And my friend has lots of questions. So anyway, I have done this activity with students where I've said the same thing that Ms. Rattleby says. And then this alien, and you can actually do this just as an activity where here are the questions an alien might ask. How are you supposed to treat other species on your planet? Everybody's going to say, oh, we should treat them with kindness and respect. I mean, that's what most people say. So many students have said that to me. And then you ask further questions. Well, is it ever okay to harm them? And then somebody will, realize like, well, we do eat them. And so Ms. Rattleby or, anybody doing this activity might say, well, do you eat dogs? They're like, no, we don't eat dogs. And Ms. Rattleby say, well, what's the difference between a dog and a pig? Or what's the difference between your parakeet and a chicken? And those questions get people thinking. So it's it's a provocative activity, but it's not trying to manipulate or persuade. It's trying to get people to think about these questions. Anyway, Ms. Rattleby is one of my favorite humane educators.
She is a great character. I really love her in the book. And she does remind me of some teachers I had in elementary and middle grade, definitely. I think it's interesting how, like, the power of questions, the power of asking questions.
Yes.
And that is something that I feel she's very good at in the book. Going back to the world becomes what we teach. You mentioned a professional development workshop you led with 10th and 12th grade math and science educators. You said you noticed a general feeling of hopelessness among the adults. I usually ask the guests what makes them feel hopeful in today's world, but since you addressed that specifically in your book, I wanted to ask how to be hopeful in today's world, how to keep your energy and mindset into a solutionary approach when we see people that are feeling a little hopeless and tired of just keep fighting.
Yeah, students too. I mean, there are rising rates of anxiety and depression among youth. One of the things that keeps me hopeful is seeing the arc of change in my own lifetime. So I'm going to be 64 years old. And when I was born, half of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. Now that's below 10%. When I was born, it was legal to discriminate based on race in the United States. Then the Civil Rights Act was passed when I was 3 years old. When I was born, smog and soot covered U.S. cities. We had lakes and rivers that were catching on fire because they were so polluted. And now the air and waterways are cleaner in the United States, by and large, not all of them, than when I was a kid. Animal rights wasn't on anybody's radar when I was a kid. And now most people believe, according to a Gallup poll anyway, that animals should be protected from cruelty. Girls and women, when I was born, if they aspired to careers, it was teaching, secretarial work, nursing. That was pretty much it. And now, at least in the United States, more girls than boys go to college. And around the world, the vast majority of girls go to school. Now, I am not a Pollyanna about this at all. We still have 800 million people who are living in extreme poverty. Racism persists. We have potentially catastrophic environmental challenges through climate change and habitat destruction and pollution. And we're seeing many hard-won rights being rolled back. So there is a lot that needs to be changed. However, much has changed for the better in my lifetime, which is to say that things can be bad and better at the same time. And if they can be better, that means they can be better still. So we have a lot of work to do, but keeping that historical perspective is a primary motivator for me. Like, I know things can change for the better. I've seen it change for the better. I know I can be part of the solution. So I think we have to remember that the media and our personal psychology as human beings is going to focus on the negative. It's going to focus on threats. We're hardwired to focus on threats. You know, if there's a potential that a predator could come get you, you are going to be acutely aware of anything that could be a danger. You're not going to be noticing all the time all the things that aren't a danger. So we just have to remember that, yes, there are a lot of threats. And yes, we have the capacity and the ingenuity and the skills to come together and solve them. We need the will to do that, and we need a process to do that. And again, I think the solutionary process is a really good process for people to embrace.
Yes. I feel I am 30 years old. I am in the cusp of the Gen Zs and millennials. So I'm like right in between those two generations. And what I see with friends and in my own social media bubble, people around my age, is that millennials are very tired and Gen Zs are they lost their hope with the world, to say it this way. And it is very reassuring every time that I hear somebody from, interestingly, younger generations and from older generations as well say a message of hope. The younger ones usually because they're not yet presented with everything, but especially folks who are my parents' age, my grandparents' age, and so on, how they bring arguments very similar to the one you just brought. Like, I've seen the world change. I've seen the transformation within my lifetime, and look where we got so far. And I think it's very important for us to hear this because we need to keep going. We need to find the strength.
Yeah, and if we don't, okay, I'm going to tell you a story. So,
Yeah.
about 12 years ago, I was invited to speak at a school in Connecticut to some 5th and 6th graders. And I asked the kids what they thought were the biggest problems in the world, and their answers filled a whiteboard. And then I asked them to raise their hands if they thought we could solve these problems. And there were 45 kids in that class, and only 5 raised their hands. Only 5 could even imagine that we could solve these problems. And that was really sobering. And this was 12 years ago. This is before the pandemic. This is before kids had, phones where they were constantly hearing about everything all the time. So I knew I had to do something to restore their hope. So I told them to close their eyes and take a few deep breaths. And then I led them in a guided visualization that went like this. I asked them to imagine that they were very old and at the end of a long and well-lived life. And they were sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day, and the air was clean, and the waterways around them were clean, and the birds were singing, and there hadn't been a war in as long as they could remember, and nobody went to bed hungry, and we had learned how to treat each other and other animals with respect and compassion. And then I told them to imagine a child coming up and joining them on the park bench. And the child had been learning history and learning about much darker times and wanted to know, how did everything change for the better? And then the child asked them, what role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? What did you do? So while these kids still had their eyes closed, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems they listed on that whiteboard. And this time 40 hands went up in the air. All it took to restore their hope was the image of a better world and knowing that they played a part in its creation. So that was a real reminder to me that we have to help young people to imagine a better world, and we have to give them the tools and the opportunities to build that better world. So a few years later, I was speaking at a conference in Guadalajara, Mexico, and the day before the conference began, I was invited to visit the school that was hosting the event. And when I got there, they said, "Hey, will you talk with our fifth graders?" So remembering those kids in Connecticut, I asked these fifth graders to raise their hands if they thought we could solve the problems in the world. And every hand flew up in the air immediately. So what was different? What was different is their teacher had been teaching them in age-appropriate ways about problems, specifically environmental problems, and they were engaged in solving them. They knew problems could be solved because they were learning to be solutionaries. So the biggest step we can take to restoring hope is engaging in making a difference. Joan Baez once said, "Action is the antidote to despair." And Professor David Orr said, "Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up." We just have to roll up our sleeves and build communities that do good work, and our hope will be restored. So for those who are feeling hopeless, get to work becoming a solutionary, and you will restore your own hope.
That is beautiful. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for being here with us today. Before I let you go, is there anything else you want to say to our listeners?
Sure. So, if you are thinking, yes, I do want to be a solutionary, how can I find out more? Come to our website, humaneeducation.org. I have a new book called The Solutionary Way, which is for people who want to be solutionaries. And I would say just learn this approach and take it on, and it will improve your own life as you transform your community and address the issues you care about and see them resolved.
Fantastic. Well, for the folks listening at home, I will add the Humane Education website link on the podcast description, Zoe's books as well, including the new book that you just mentioned. I'm going to add all the links in the podcast description. So if anybody is interested, just time that you're listening to this episode, just go there in the description and the links are going to be available for you. And thank you very much one more time. I loved our chat. And thank you for your time with us.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And I will just say, if anybody is thinking, I want to be a humane educator, we have loads of resources, from free resources to a micro-credential program to our graduate programs that are online with Antioch University. So you can, if this path seems like the right path for you, we're here to help.
Amazing. Not only just listening to the message, but taking action.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was our interview with author and humane educator, Zoe Weil. Thank you very much for joining us for another episode. It is great to talk to you again after a little break. We are back to our regular schedule, so in 2 weeks from now, you'll get a brand new Lantern Voices episode with another one of our authors. And if you go to our website, lanternpm.org, and access our ebook store, you'll see on the right-hand side a little tab saying podcast. That's where all the books ever featured in the podcast now or in the future are going to be located if you want to buy your special copy with 25% off. How do you do that? Well, of course, you go to the website, lanternpm.org, select the ebook store on the main menu on the top, then select podcasts, find the book that you want. So it can be The World Becomes What We Teach. It can be Claude and Medea if you want to gift it to a child in your life, and then select the books. Put it in your cart, and once you hit the cart option to proceed with payment, just add the coupon Lantern Voices 25. That is Lantern Voices, just like the podcast name, and the numbers 2 and 5 all together, no spaces, and that will give you 25% off your purchase. Remember, that coupon is only valid for ebooks and only at our ebook store on our website, lanternpm.org. And for those of you who are buying ebooks and going to our website, you may see some spoilers of the episodes that are coming up. Yes, because we update the discount coupon periodically to reflect our new books. So a little bit of backstage magic for you all. After I'm done with recording a new batch of episodes, I go to our website and I update the coupon to reflect the new episodes that I just recorded. However, what usually happens is that I record 1 month, 2 months, even 3 months ahead of the episode's release date. So if the book is already on the podcast tab on our website, make sure that you get your copy, use our discount coupon, especially for our listeners, Lantern Voices 25, and go read it, because yes, that author is going to be featured in our podcast, and the episode is most likely already recorded. Thank you once again for joining us here. I'll talk to you all next week for a brand new Long-Term Voices episode. Take care. Goodbye.